Hollywood. It's a place as notorious as the name itself. A glittering desert dense with ambition and opportunity, an industry that will either realise your wildest dreams or ruin your life. And to many, it's an unfathomable career choice, impossible to break into and even more difficult to break away from. But to those that love it, it's hard to imagine wanting anything else. We make films because we fall in love with a feeling, a mood that washes over you, a projection on a screen, another life taking over. We watch, we laugh, we cry, sometimes together and sometimes alone. But to some people, it's a ritual. It's necessary, life-affirming, inspiring, devastating, a source of comfort and confrontation. It is life itself. And when you have this realization, there's no going back, and you yearn to be a part of it, no matter the cost. If you don't read the small print, then the possibilities seem endless. But once you start working in the industry, the small print becomes inescapable, a clash at the heart of the industry that you can't avoid. That the place responsible for the magic of filmmaking is also the same place famous for its disturbing and insidious practices on the inside. It's a place of fame and notoriety, the uneven distribution of wealth, those with power and those who can't use their voice, talent, creativity, pushing boundaries, creating boundaries. It feels like independent cinema doesn't exist anymore. People in power keep saying they care about diversity, but you kind of feel like they don't.
And after all, we're all from Africa originally.
Apparently, it's also a great time to be a woman in film because the Me Too movement ended misogyny, even though you keep having interactions with men in the industry that make you want to crawl out of your skin. But you must be wrong because they keep telling you it's a really great time to be a female. Harvey Weinstein's convictions were overturned. Shia LaBeouf is working with one of the most famous directors of all time, and Johnny Depp is the new face of Dior. AI is the future of screenwriting. Nepo babies rule the industry, and the number of working-class people in film has never been lower. But all the rich kids in London are thriving on their unpaid internships and parents' money. But don't worry, you won't notice the wealth gap because they'll describe themselves as also being poor.
I definitely had moments where I couldn't afford groceries and things like that and needed to ask my mom to help me.
Art is seen as content, and no film has better captured the dichotomy of this dream, the clash between the love for the medium and contempt towards the business, than Babylon. Damien Chazelle's Hollywood epic was released onto a strange cinematic landscape during the winter of 2022. It was over 3 hours long, cost $80 million to make, and is largely labelled as a flop. The story follows Manny, someone who longs to make movies, and Nellie, who wants to be in them, who both begin their careers during the transition from silent to talking pictures. And the film confronts us with the reality of filmmaking, the systemic issues in Hollywood and toxicity of the business, the contradicting feelings as you throw yourself into the machine, dangerous and exciting all at once. It's a mixture of talent and luck, being able to stand your ground but also not question anything, not knowing whether you're creating your legacy or demise, adding a nail to the coffin or a star next to your name. Ultimately, it tells us that no matter how hard you work, your contributions will be absorbed into the Hollywood machine and you will be discarded, because the movies will keep running without you. And perhaps Babylon was less popular with mass audiences because it exposes this truth, that it was made for filmmakers and movie lovers who understand these contradictions, both a love letter and an exposé, shining light on the darker, less glittery side of Hollywood that many don't want to believe is there, but a side that has always existed. Which leaves us with one question. What does the future of film look like? And how did we end up like this? In order to find out, we need to go back in time, to the beginning of Hollywood as we know it, where I'll analyse each systemic issue within the film industry and trace them back to their roots, and try to figure out how the hell we got here. Welcome back to Pompous Unhelpful Knit, and to my deep dive on everything wrong with the film industry. How did you break into the industry? It's a question asked at nearly any industry panel, Q&A or interview. And it's a question asked so often because for an industry known for this particular challenge, there is no straightforward answer or guaranteed route to success, or at least, none that people want to publicly acknowledge. Whilst there were fewer people who could find work in the film industry in the past, there were at least more entry-level positions that allowed people to work their way up. Nearly any man could get a job as a production assistant, runner or paperboy and work their way up to being a full-blown Hollywood producer or screenwriter. Success was more likely because there were less people doing it and it was limited to a certain demographic. But the industry has changed since then. Hollywood would proudly shout from the rooftops that anyone can work in the film industry. If you have a good work ethic and passion for film, then that's all you need. Now, I would absolutely love for this to be true, but the truth is, the industry has never been harder to break into. With more people pursuing film as a career, it's perhaps the most competitive it's ever been, and especially when you live in a city like London or LA, it feels like nearly every second person you meet is a screenwriter, filmmaker, or actor. Entry-level positions don't exist anymore. Those with wealth and interpersonal connections mysteriously find their way into jobs that they aren't qualified for. The pay is terrible, and a job in the creative industries is becoming increasingly unlikely for the average person. Which leaves us with this question: how do you actually break into the industry? And I'll give you a clue. It's all about who you know or how much your parents earn. And if you don't know anyone or have no generational wealth, then either get to know or get f***ed. Since its creation, the film industry has been a business that operates on the principle of exclusivity. After starting as a small cesspit in the middle of a desert where jobs were given to friends and friends of friends and family members, it's no surprise that having connections to those on the inside is a huge advantage. Your skill set, passion, talent, or work ethic is important, but never as important as who you know. But instead of this being a contributing factor towards whether or not you're given an opportunity, it is now one of the biggest determining factors towards whether or not you'll even be considered for something. And it's this limitation that has created a huge barrier for many that are trying to access work in the film industry. Because in order to be a part of it, you have to already be a part of it in some way. So who exactly can work in film now? The top of the industry is nearly exclusive to those with wealth and connections, and those without either will barely be allowed into the low-level positions that are fundamental to the filmmaking process. And typically, people have attained power and high-level positions, rarely on the basis of talent, and mostly from interpersonal connections, the sole merit of being a white man, or through nepotism. We'll come back to the first one later on, so for now, let's talk about nepotism. The discussion of nepotism within Hollywood may appear somewhat tedious to people outside of the industry, but it's important to mention when there's such a blatant disparity towards favouring people with family members or long-standing connections in the industry. And at its core, it makes sense why this happens. Hollywood thrives on exclusivity, and what's more exclusive than family? Either people rise to fame and are reluctant to hand over their power, so it stays in the family, or the people in power don't want to take a risk on new people that haven't been vetted, so they go for the safe option of working with someone they already know. It's a way of bringing in new people without actually bringing in new people, and perhaps more importantly, not allowing anyone to challenge the status quo. People typically refute the nepotism argument by saying, but what parent wouldn't want to help their child succeed if they knew they could help? Yes, that's true. But the issue with nepotism in relation to the film industry is that you can skip a process that is the majority of the workload for most other people, all by having direct access to an industry that is largely impenetrable. You can skip years of auditions, networking, meetings, trying to meet the right person, as someone in the crowd who could turn your life around, the years of working shitty jobs and balancing a 9-to-5 alongside trying to pursue your creative passions, all because one of your parents can get you a meeting that takes you to the penultimate step, a step that others spend years trying to get to. To defend this label with the fact that they still had to work hard or that it diminishes their talent is irrelevant and insulting. No one is saying that they don't work hard or have talent, but the main challenge for most other people is just getting a foot in the door. And the idea that being born with a foot in the door isn't advantageous in any way is completely insane. But whilst the Hollywood elite and nepo babies rule the top of the industry, there will always be people needed at the bottom to do the dirty work. Because it's fairly unlikely that Lily Rose Depp is going to work for minimum wage as a gaffer or camera assistant. And for the average person who is actually able to break into the industry, this is most likely where you will find your place. And this is, without a doubt, the worst rung of the ladder. You will be exploited, overworked, underpaid, sometimes gaslit, manipulated, harassed. You will feel disgusted, disrespected, small, powerless, and all the while you will have to maintain how grateful you are for the opportunity to be paid £12 an hour to collect trainers and buy cheese straws for someone who earns millions. As explored through the characters of Manny, Nellie, and Sydney in Babylon, Hollywood has always thrived off of the labour and talent of the working class and people of colour who are trying to make their dreams come true. The opening scene that shows Manny trying to push an elephant up a hill is a metaphorical representation of the uphill battle and challenges that marginalised people face as they try to make it in the industry. An industry that couldn't run without these people, yet constantly underpays and undervalues those who take on these roles. The same goes for Sydney Palmer, an extremely talented musician who has to compromise his values and dignity in order to succeed, being humiliated and mistreated by the white producers who make racist comments and ask him to darken his skin. We see the same with Nelly, an incredible actor from a working class background, who the industry exploits for her talents, all whilst turning their nose up at her because she doesn't come from money. The people at the top want to reap the benefits of exploiting the labour of marginalised people without ever really letting them into the industry or properly crediting or paying them, because you can work for the club, but you can't really be in it. The people who make the movies we watch and love are the ones paid minimum wage, because Robert Downey Jr. will be paid $80 million for his work on another Marvel movie, whilst the editors and animators of those very films were paid $12.50 an hour. Whilst there were fewer people who could break into the industry in the past, there were at least more entry points. But now we've sort of switched the other way around, because whilst more people are able to access the film industry, entry-level opportunities are now either non-existent, require years of experience and therefore aren't entry-level anymore, or are extremely oversaturated with thousands of people applying, meaning that they end up having to give it to the person with the most experience or the person who knows someone within the company, which is, again, nepotism. So naturally, if you're an average person, you won't get any of these opportunities, because if you don't know anyone and don't have experience, it's nearly impossible. And this leaves you with two options. Either find unpaid work in the film industry, or find paid work that isn't in the film industry. And if you're not wealthy and don't have connections to the inside, you'll obviously have to choose the latter option, because you can't sit around for years waiting for a job that might never come. But something about this is very unfair.
This is a goddamn bitch of an unsatisfactory situation.
Because the wealthy people who can afford to take unpaid opportunities can quickly work their way into the industry. And what's so deeply wrong with these current hiring practices is that they naturally exclude the huge number of people that can't afford to work for free, thus creating an insidious rule within the industry that you can only succeed if you're rich or if you know somebody. And during my own job search, this is something that repeatedly came up. And so before we continue with this chapter, I will now share a quick anecdote about my own journey into the industry. It all started when I graduated 3 years ago, around the same time that I started this very channel. I was naively optimistic and thought that having a good work ethic and genuine passion for film would be enough to get an entry-level job in the film industry. I left film school and got what I thought would be a temporary job as a receptionist, where I thought I'd stay for maybe 2 months before finding something. Cut to 8 months later. Besides a few interviews with a certain streaming platform that for legal reasons I'll say rhymes with the word Scooby, I was no closer to finding anything. I stupidly decided to quit my stable but incredibly boring job to make a short film and focus full-time on finding a new job. Again, naively, I thought this would take maybe a month. Cut to 4 months later. I'd run out of savings and was incredibly depressed. I realised that finding an entry-level position could potentially take years, so I went back to my old job to temp for the summer so I could pay my rent. I thought I would stay for maybe 3 months. Cut to 10 months later. After hundreds more rejections from countless entry-level positions and a million more breakdowns, I was at the end of my tether. My self-esteem had never been lower, and I doubted whether there was a place for me in the industry at all. And as a perfectionist who bases nearly all of my self-esteem on my work, I felt like a complete waste of space. So one day I decided to write an essay about ordinary people, which ended up being about depression, and I created a blog to post it, not thinking anyone would see it. Then, a couple of weeks later, I received an email. Someone in the industry had seen one of my video essays and wanted to meet me about a work opportunity. And the only way they'd been able to contact me was through the creation of this blog I'd made, which had a contact feature. And that was my journey into the industry. And the thing is that even though I was miserable for nearly 3 years and couldn't find any opportunity on my own, I was, all things considered, extremely lucky, because it was only 3 years and I was lucky enough that the job found me. And who knows how long I would have been searching if the YouTube algorithm didn't just happen to recommend my video that particular day. I'd probably still be searching. But what was infuriating about this whole process was that on paper, I should have been a good candidate for many of these jobs. They were entry-level positions and I had the so-called passion and work ethic that everyone bangs on about as being the key to success. But I was repeatedly going for interviews only to get to the final stage and be told that they gave it to someone with more experience. And what was even more infuriating was that from my graduating year group, while some people were deeply struggling to find any film-related opportunities, some of them were quickly finding work, either because they knew someone or because they could afford to work for free, or because they had wealthy parents who were paying their rent. And even then, I found that a lot of those people didn't even know they were rich and actively denied their own privilege or pretended to be poor. In a recent study by Channel 4, they discovered that less than 1 in 10 people in the creative industries are from a working class background. Rich people can afford to pursue careers in the creative industries because when you don't need to earn money and can afford to work for free, then there is no pressure or risk. You'll still be able to pay your bills, whilst also having more time to solely focus on your creative passions and nurture your craft. And I'll say it, if there is no financial pressure with your work, then it isn't a job, it's a hobby. And certain policies made by our previous Tory government exacerbated the wealth gap after they scrapped unemployment benefits for creators who were out of work, leading to a sector that is dominated by people with the wealth to sustain themselves during periods of unemployment or instability. But in countries like France and Finland, their government matches your pay during periods of unemployment, and on top of that, provides monthly maintenance grants to support artists, because they value their work and understand the cultural importance of having a thriving and diverse creative industry. Because of this, there are people who cannot afford to be creative anymore, and the film industry has become a playground for rich kids. Meanwhile, the people who can't find creative work because they can't afford to work for free have to find a paying job outside of the industry, which only brings a whole new set of problems. Because if you're working a typical 9-to-5 job, it leaves very little time to pursue your creative career, usually meaning you have to work in your free time or weekends, you burn out more quickly and generally have less time and energy to do the things you love, which ultimately means it will take longer for you to succeed and more likely that you'll quit entirely. The increasing commonality of the idea that only wealthy and extremely privileged people can afford to be creative and work in the arts is so deeply wrong. Expressing yourself, whether that be through creativity or something else, is a human right and something that should be protected and encouraged. But in a business ruled by rich kids, nepotism, lack of equal opportunity and accessibility, working in the arts just isn't a viable career path to so many people, and now almost exclusively exists for those who come from privilege. Having access to creativity is one of the few ways that we can expand our world, and it's one of the few career paths that creates upward mobility and can impact your quality of life in a significant way. And the lack of funding and open opportunities in the arts is a way of controlling and suppressing working class people, because denying marginalised people the chance to be creative is a way of not allowing people to have a voice and to imagine more for themselves. Because creativity creates change, and change is a threat to those in power. It can sometimes feel like there is no place for you within the industry and that no matter what you do, you will never belong or find a way to make it work. Most of the work is just working hard to not give up and finding a way to keep going. You can have all the talent and the best work ethic in the world, but it's really just a waiting game and complete luck of the draw, and trying not to quit whilst doing so. All of this is to say, the film industry is notoriously difficult to get into, but for some people, it's easier for reasons that have nothing to do with skill, talent, or passion, and the career is only financially sustainable for those with pre-existing wealth or power. More people with power in the industry need to advocate for social mobility within the arts, because Hollywood can continue making all these vague statements about boosting diversity, but some of the biggest barriers preventing growth and diversity in the industry right now are the economic barriers that stop people from even considering film as a career. If we're going to have any real chance at diversity and equal opportunity in the film industry, then we need to create genuinely accessible entry-level positions, sustainable incomes that don't limit creativity to those with money, and to invest more into the arts, to those that deserve the opportunity to make and share stories, and to all the people behind the scenes that make movies happen. For anyone that's filled out a diversity standards form made by you'll be familiar with the paradoxical wording of the requirements that asks you to have an in-depth three-dimensional portrayal of a main character with a marginalised identity, while simultaneously asking that nearly all of your secondary characters have marginalised identities, and that you must explore every single one of these identities in a rich and complex way. Now, we absolutely deserve to create and enjoy diverse stories that are authentic and reflective of all people. But this particular approach to diversity creates a new set of problems. With less money being funded into independent projects and an increasingly competitive film market, small-scale projects have to prove their social value by having an extensive exploration of every marginalised identity, which is nearly impossible. Because if anyone is even going to consider giving you money, it has to benefit the public image of the studio heads by fulfilling their entire diversity quota. If each project needs to be authentic to everyone, instead of being authentic to the person creating it, it goes against the very principle of authenticity, because you're trying to speak to experiences that you can't understand, and taking away from something you do understand, that on its own could make for an interesting and authentic story. But when trying to represent as many marginalised identities as possible in every single project, it only 1. Leads to watered-down portrayals of complex stories and characters, 2. Creates stories where characters are defined entirely by their marginalised identity, 3. Sometimes unintentionally creates trauma porn, and 4. Exploit the demand for films that explore important subjects to sell your story. I will now respond to and discuss each individual problem I have raised. 1. Surely it is better to have a story that focuses on one thing and explores it in great detail, instead of requiring that each story has significant representation of every single underrepresented group. This leads to watered-down stories and surface-level representation, which does a massive disservice to people that deserve to have their stories shared without being used to fulfill a production company's diversity quota. 2. Having a character be defined by their marginalised identity does not seem like a three-dimensional or authentic portrayal. It's similar to the sex education model, where the show was created to talk about general issues around teenagers having sex, and then evolved to how can we cover every single issue ever and involve it in a storyline, which has then created a show where each character is defined by their marginalised identity, has no thoughts or personality outside of this, and doesn't allow enough time to explore anything in detail because they're trying to cover so many topics. Like the testicular cancer storyline in the last season that crops up for maybe 2 minutes. It just isn't reflective of the way people are in real life, and it's insulting to people who occupy these identities when they're explored in a way that implies they have no personality outside of this. People are so much more interesting than these stories give credit for. 3. Not only this, but I've noticed that often choose the most traumatic and explicit versions of these underseen stories, which seems counterproductive to positive representation if you're constantly showing marginalised people within the context of their traumatic experiences, which just feels like another coded way of oppression. The first iterations of this can be traced back to the origins of the term trauma porn, which originally stemmed from the depiction of people of colour in film and the commercialisation of black pain, which we can literally see from the very first Hollywood films ever made, such as in D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. This has evolved to include many other marginalised communities over time, with queer stories also peddling these traumatic narratives, recently including Close by Lucas Don, Monster by Coriader, and in some way, All of Us Strangers also does this.
Son of a bitch!
It seems like in order to get their attention now, you need to have the most extreme subject matter that relates to a real-life issue, which often means that people have to use particularly traumatic experiences in order for the project to receive enough attention to actually get funding, i.e. a film I saw at the LFF last year about female genital mutilation. It goes without saying that it's a horrendous thing and an incredibly important issue, but the film itself felt very much like trauma porn, as it mostly depicted the abuse that was happening and the characters didn't have any arc outside of these horrible things. The film definitely raised awareness of this particular issue, but it wasn't a particularly well-crafted or interesting story, and didn't have anything constructive to say about the issue at hand. It was just saying, look how awful this thing is, even though we already know objectively this is horrific. The organisation in question almost seems to think that each film about any marginalised group has to raise awareness of something. And I've said this before, but stories should always come first. Making any film with the intention of sharing a message or theme, instead of creating an interesting story that also happens to share a message or theme, is, in my opinion, not the right way to create an impactful film. And we deserve to see joyous stories, and that is perhaps more revolutionary and impactful. A sadly common trend we're seeing more than ever within the film industry is the exploitation of traumatic stories in order for mostly men to advance their careers. Note Bombshell, the Pam and Tommy series, Blonde, Holy Spider, The Idol. I've noticed this a lot with stories about traumatic female experiences that are marketed as feminist films, but without women in leading creative roles, you can enrich the project with their own lived experiences and create meaningful conversation or insights around the issue. I've also noticed that in some films about feminist issues where women are given leading creative roles, like She Said, the film isn't given the same level of funding or support, leading to a poor script which only does negative service to the cause and discussion. I was so hyped about this movie in particular because it's a great story, and was so disappointed that they made a great topic so incredibly boring and low stake. In general, there are too many men in the industry who are trusted with the power to share stories they cannot understand, taking the opportunity from people that could create a film enriched by their own experience and that could have an impact on the mainstream discussion of these issues. I have a theory that this is a deliberate decision on behalf of the studio executives. They're perhaps scared to give power to people with experience of these things to be in charge of these projects, because they know it will create uncomfortable conversations and genuine progress. And ultimately, Hollywood doesn't care about progression or diversity in any real way. It's why films like She Said and Bombshell are so disappointing, because they take genuinely interesting subjects and execute them so badly that people are then going to be disinterested in the next film made that covers a similar topic, which ends up reducing audiences' willingness to see or discuss these stories in the first place. But we've also seen the exploitation of traumatic stories in other ways, such as in films like May December, a film about Hollywood's exploitation of traumatic experiences for entertainment and their unethical storytelling practices, which became hugely hypocritical when it was revealed that Todd Haynes didn't receive consent for sharing this story from the people that it was based on, with the real-life couple receiving a new wave of unwanted media attention and later coming forward to say how the film had made their lives very difficult. 4. The demand for stories that explore social issues is also being exploited by some filmmakers who falsely market a film as exploring a certain issue without following through on this in the storytelling in any way, e.g. Saltburn, which is apparently a satire about class and wealth. More on this later. It's incredibly difficult to find funding for any independent project, but now there's the expectation that because there are so few opportunities to finance an independent film, you have to earn the right for funding by showcasing all the lesser seen stories out there, which shouldn't be the expectation of any one project. And like I said earlier, in theory, it's great because these stories deserve to be shared. But when they either showcase the most traumatic versions of these stories, or underdevelop them so that it doesn't do it justice, or find someone to direct or write the project that can't relate to it, it ends up feeling counterproductive. Or they force filmmakers to diversify their project in a way that feels exploitative. Reducing each character to their marginalised identity doesn't add individuality to a story. If you want to destroy any chance of having fleshed out three-dimensional characters, then having to describe them with reductive labels that reduce people to objects feels like a surefire way to do it. Unfortunately, a lot of the projects that do well in this process are the ones that aren't fully fleshed out scripts, and are given funding because the production companies want to capitalise on the underrepresented aspect of the story before some other production company gets there first. This creates films like Pinecone, which was selected for BFI Flair Festival this year, and I was completely baffled as to why, because it was, and I don't want to say this, not very good. At its core, the film is about an underseen group of people and a story that absolutely deserves to be shared, but unfortunately, the film was underdeveloped and could have benefited from more funding and support. I think it was most likely selected because it showed an aspect of an experience that hadn't been seen before, which isn't a bad thing, but because it isn't a particularly good film, it just doesn't do justice to the people they're trying to represent. Instead of rushing to greenlight a bunch of bad films purely for the sake of ticking a box and creating, quote, representation, it would be much better to just provide proper funding and support to a few really great stories that do justice to the people they're showcasing.
1, 2, 3, 4, let me hear you scream if you want some more. Like, push it, watch me work it. I'm perfect.
I have a theory that everything made in the next few years will try to replicate the Saltburn model of filmmaking. Linus Sandgren is going to be booked and busy. And you might be thinking, what's wrong with that? It was a hugely popular movie that had huge monetary success. Yes, objectively yes. But what I find disturbing about this type of filmmaking is that it succeeds because it follows this new social media model of filmmaking that follows these 4 rules. 1. Movies created with the visuals being prioritised over the story, with a main focus on their aesthetic appeal. 2. The new model of Twitter casting, which is essentially when they cast actors based on their popularity on social media, and more specifically, who the general public are currently crushing on. 3. A huge marketing budget and campaign. And 4. Claiming the film explores a topical social issue and then not following through on this in the storytelling. I will now respond to and discuss each individual problem I have raised. 1. I would argue that the cinematography of a film is the most accessible filmmaking element for the general movie-going public to notice and discuss because it's, visual, you can see it. And if you see something that's lit in fun colours and looks pretty, then your brain sees it and likes it. Cinematography is important, but in combination with other elements that are also well executed, and the visual style of a film shouldn't be a crutch for an underdeveloped story. I think we're going to see more films being released with a heavy emphasis on their visual appeal, with shots created purely with the intention for them to be screenshotted and shared on Twitter for people to share and be like, oh my god, the cinematography. Which, yes, it's impressive when something looks good. It means the DP has done a good job. But sometimes I think it's a distraction from poor writing and an underdeveloped story, feeding the audience shiny objects to hide the fact that besides the way it looks, there isn't that much substance. 2. So about Twitter casting. A great example of this was the recently announced Beatles biopic. Now, this would have been a great chance to find new and undiscovered talent from Liverpool from working class backgrounds. But no, they cast Barry Keoghan, Paul Mescal and Harris Dickinson, and I wouldn't be surprised if they also tried to get Josh O'Connor and Jeremy White. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these actors, they're all great performers. But it doesn't feel like much thought has gone into it when they cast the most popular actors in Hollywood right now and just shove who everyone's feeling horny about in one film as a way of selling more tickets. It also feels like this brand of casting attempts to feed into the nature of parasocial relationships by creating content that capitalizes on the audience members' desire for more screen time with their favorite celebrities and the creation of fan cams. I first came across the idea of parasocial romantic content when that TikTok was uploaded. In the casting of the Beatles biopic and the next Knives Out installment, it's essentially an Avengers assemble of people that everyone is currently crushing on and thirsting after on Twitter. There are some movies that have the cast finalised before the script or story has even been decided, known as movie packages, which first came about after the success of The Exorcist and Jaws. It essentially acts as another marketing tool, with stories and shots being created to be talked about on social media and to capitalise on parasocial relationships, as a way of enticing the studios by the project's potential marketability. To me, it seemed like half the shots of Barry Keoghan and Jacob Elordi were created for audience members to use in fan cams on TikTok, because there was no meaning for this shot, or this one. 3. The huge marketing campaigns. In general, I'm fine with this, but you also need to give marketing budgets to smaller movies, instead of complaining that no one sees them when you don't spend a single dime on advertising or posters. It just creates a completely uneven playing field, and means that smaller movies don't stand a chance. 4. Saltburn had a great marketing campaign, one of the best trailers of last year, and a large part of their marketing campaign was selling it as a satire about social class and elitism, which for me was the main reason why I was interested in first seeing Promising Young Woman and subsequently Saltburn. In Saltburn, the demand for stories that explore current issues was exploited, and we were instead given a film with colourful lighting, horny shots, and a half-baked Mr. Ripley-esque story, all with dodgy messaging implying we should pity the rich because working-class people leech off of their wealth, with no nuance or depth to any of its observations about the wealthy elite in Britain. It doesn't come across as any surprise that the writer falls short on creating a relevant criticism or commentary on this subject, as she comes from the very same background that she is apparently satiring. And now she's developing a Wuthering Heights adaptation, which will no doubt have a huge budget whilst also being labelled as an independent film, with some kind of modern twist, a Kate Bush song and a commentary on feminism that will end up with all the women dead. I feel that the push for the fucked up social satire genre of filmmaking exploded after the release of Get Out, which showed that there was a demand for films that are both entertaining and confrontational, something that challenges viewers by creating a puzzle out of the political messaging embedded within the story. But, alas, this is not the case with Saltburn. There is no deeper political puzzle beneath the bathtub. It is a beautiful, vapid mess. Ultimately, what's concerning about this type of filmmaking is that there's no risk, and besides the visual style, there's not much originality. The social media model of filmmaking is essentially replicating the risk-free style of content that we see online. Posting something that looks aesthetically pleasing is safe. Posting videos where you hide behind the words and opinions of other people or don't really say anything at all is also very safe.
So, what is the point of the conversation we're having?
These are nearly guaranteed ways of creating something non-offensive that people will watch, and an easy way for the person posting to generate clicks, whilst hiding behind the authenticity of other people. When creators value quick, uncontroversial, and harmless content purely for the sake of feeding an algorithm, it's no surprise we see these endless videos motivated by appearance, aesthetics, and airtime instead of substance. Everyone has their own personal philosophy around creativity, but for me, making and sharing something should feel a bit risky, and I don't see the point in sharing something unless it either feels like it could only have come from me and is original, or there is vulnerability in it. And with the influence of the content style we see on social media, I can only imagine that we will continue to see the Saltburnification of cinema, films that play it safe by favouring style over substance, with flashy lights, glittery colours, beautiful people, and not much else. It's a great time to be a woman in film. The Me Too and Time's Up movement ended misogyny, and men in the industry keep saying that it's a really great time to be a quote-unquote female. Harvey Weinstein's convictions were overturned. Shia LaBeouf is working with one of the most famous directors of all time. Johnny Depp is the new face of Dior, and Roman Polanski debuted his new film at Cannes. Countless actors say how thrilled they are that Kevin Spacey is making his return to acting and is being given airtime on TV to talk about how hard the trial has been for him. Jonathan Majors was offered the Perseverance Award at the Hollywood Unlocked Impact Awards, which is given to an individual who has shown that no matter what adversity they face, they will continue to aspire to inspire. The adversity in question is not going to jail for abusing his girlfriend. Sources say that Coppola was trying to kiss the female extras on set of Megalopolis to, quote, get them in the mood. Everyone in Hollywood is enthusiastically pretending that Brad Pitt's assault allegations don't exist. There's a child rapist competing in the Olympics, but they promise us that allegations ruin men's lives. The male ego has in many ways ruined the film industry. Fame, talent, and power is a combination that doesn't leave many unscathed, creating this invincible armor that allows men in power to do whatever they want. This toxic culture of male absolution within the film industry is ultimately a celebration of perversion, because it's seen as a status/power symbol to not face the consequences of doing illegal things. We see this through the idea of the asshole of Los Angeles and Babylon. Much like how super rich people lose the dopamine rush from small purchases, which leads them to spend increasing amounts of money on ridiculous purchases to feel anything, it's the same with the abuse of power. And in the case of some men in the film industry, it leads them to do increasingly perverse things in order to get that same rush of power, like paying a man to eat a rat and finding enjoyment in seeing people with less power being degraded and humiliated. It's not enjoyable to those characters because they take pleasure in those specific acts. They find enjoyment in this extreme display of power that comes from placing other people beneath you. This triple threat combination of fame, talent, and power inflates the male ego to an unhealthy level, playing into pre-existing messages about masculinity and entitlement, which is exacerbated in the film industry to a whole new level. Unfortunately, this is the kind of behaviour that's been allowed for decades, but I think it became particularly more prominent during the Brat Pack era of Hollywood, the 70s. The industry had experienced a huge decline in the 50s, and European cinema was making creative advancements that Hollywood just couldn't keep up with. The studios had all the power, but slowly started to relinquish this when these art house directors came onto the scene and pitched movies such as Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown, and Jaws to the notorious heads of BBS Productions, Bert Schneider and Bob Rafelson. And it was these very films that revitalized the American film market and put Hollywood back on the cinematic map. BBS quickly started to make a lot of money, and Bert and Bob were described as, quote, drug-crazed womanizers. These directors who hadn't been exposed to this level of wealth or success before were now on top of the world. And it's this sudden escalation to fame that shortly made the world of filmmaking in Hollywood a pretty hellish landscape for many. It goes without saying that the on-set stories from this era are infamous. If you haven't already read Peter Biskin's book, Easy Riders Raging Bulls, then definitely give it a read, as it describes most of what happened. But in essence, sets were unorganised and chaotic. There was no code of conduct between directors and actors, so people would be verbally and physically abused, manipulated, subjected to ridiculous working hours and conditions, and all because the director had a vision. Bogdanovich refused to introduce himself to people because he assumed everyone knew who he was. But before fame, he was a small-town boy enamoured with his wife, collaborator, and high school sweetheart, Polly. But after the success of The Last Picture Show, his ego became insufferable and he had an affair with Sybil Shepherd, which was public knowledge on set whilst Polly was there. She was said to have directed his next film, Paper Moon, as much as he did, but was only credited for being a production designer. Dennis Hopper married Michelle Phillips, and they broke up within a week because he apparently handcuffed her up in the house, claiming she needed to be locked up because she was a witch and he tried to shoot her. Bert Schneider was, quote, dating a 16-year-old girl. Paul Schrader threatened to drive a woman off the road and kill her if she didn't kiss him. On the set of The Exorcist, there was a shot of bacon frying in a pan, and Friedkin decided he wanted to dolly back, so they had to completely rebuild the set because there was a wall in the way. Then, he didn't like the way the bacon was curling, so they had to find preservative-free bacon so it would fry flat, halting the production for days on end. He hated working with actors and would shoot guns to scare them and play the Psycho soundtrack on set.
Who said that? First, let's talk about who said it.
Okay.
He slapped a priest in the face to get him in the mood for a scene. Ellen Burstyn wore a wire down her back for one particular stunt. She said the stuntman was pulling the wire too hard and it was hurting her.
I felt them exchange a look.
And he said, "Give it to her this time." And I said, "Really?" And he says, "Give it to her." And this is Ellen Burstyn, right? You're a nice lady. And so I said, "Okay." So when I hauled off, she came completely off her feet.
You see me hit and you see me reach for my back. I screamed in horrendous pain. Billy motioned to Owen to tilt the camera down on me. And I saw it and I was so furious.
These directors could treat the people around them as being disposable and less than, all because they were male artists and no one else could possibly live up to their creative genius, creating this toxic, consequenceless culture that allowed them to do whatever they wanted, at the expense of whoever they wanted. And even if they didn't have talent or creative genius, men were given opportunities purely because they were men or because they looked a certain way, such as Robert Evans, who was hired to oversee the production of The Godfather because, quote, they needed a good-looking guy to head the company. They bought him a big house in Beverly Hills with a pool and tennis courts, and he apparently had so many girls over that his maid had to write their names on bits of paper next to his coffee each morning so he wouldn't forget who they were. It's all been there from the start. These men were revered and put on a pedestal that allowed and excused their abuse of power and predatory behaviour, all because Hollywood values their contributions to the industry more than the safety of women. Men in the industry are continually protected by every authority and institution, given platforms to reform and rebuild after actions that ruin the lives of other people, facing no consequences for an endless list of abuse. Whilst I would say that general on-set practices are much better, it is absolutely not a problem exclusive to the past. And this level of abuse in the film industry still happens, but in a more discreet and insidious way. I personally see no change in the way these cases are handled by the press and media, and my recent experiences in the industry only point to the fact that it's getting worse, because the basic level of mainstream awareness around these issues, combined with the still massive egos of these men, leads them to think that they haven't done anything wrong and they're, quote, one of the good guys, all because they worked with one woman or know who Greta Gerwig is. I cannot count the number of meetings I've had with men in the industry who have started off by making some comment like, "Oh, I won't hug you because I don't want to get me too'd," or "You have to be so careful these days, if I look at you the wrong way I'll end up getting cancelled," only to go on and do things much worse than shaking my hand. Which is so funny to me because it only, 1, invalidates the entire movement and proves their lack of understanding and allyship, and 2, it's comical that they think being cancelled or going to prison is such a genuine threat, when I cannot think of a single person in this industry that's happened to. They just create new awards, platforms and brand deals to rebuild their careers and pretend the whole thing never happened. In thinking they're immune from doing anything wrong, they won't take any accountability when they do act wrongly, separating themselves from the rest of the industry and acting like they don't work within the same systems of power as a way of manipulating others and protecting their image. This is so much scarier, because they're still doing the same fucked up things, but they're completely unable to see it. This separation of men into good and bad only inflates the ego of the, quote, good men in a way that makes them more threatening, because they wear this label like an exemption badge from doing anything wrong, blinding their judgment and making them unable to take accountability or see their own mistakes. Just because you're not physically abusing your power doesn't mean there aren't a myriad of other ways that this can happen. The separation between good and bad doesn't account for this whole grey area that nearly all men fall into. But because they're not one of the obviously bad guys like Harvey Weinstein, then that means they're great. And if that's the case, then you're automatically immune from ever doing anything wrong, even when you're doing something obviously wrong. The male ego is one of the most dangerous things in the world, and in an industry where most of the power is still held by men, it's no surprise that they make light of the issues that don't affect them, assuming these are problems that no longer exist because they're publicly discussed, and if they are still happening, they don't actually care to know, blind to the way these problems manifest now, proclaiming to know everything and possess self-awareness, but completely delusional in their complicity or their own contribution towards the disturbing practices that make the film industry an unsafe and deeply uncomfortable work environment for so many women. When it comes to films that are currently being released, we now have 3 categories: high-budget blockbuster movies, Films that are labelled as being from independent directors, but who are actually now studio directors, such as Lanthimos and Guadagnino, and actually independent films. People like Jennifer Lopez, Chris Pratt, and Robert Downey Jr. can continue to work on films that allows them to buy multiple houses, who also actively choose to diminish the importance of and shit on independent filmmaking, whilst the industry pretends that independent cinema is flourishing, praising directors like Luca Guadagnino and Yorgos Lanthimos for keeping it alive. But these directors, as great as they are, just aren't independent filmmakers anymore. They're the poster boys for independent cinema with studio-level funding and success. And then you have actual indie filmmakers and creatives who are struggling to find funding and are being asked to jump through flaming hoops and justify why their story is important and why it deserves to be shared, when I don't see anyone at Marvel asking whether or not the Fantastic Four remake is, quote, diverse enough to be rebooted for the fucking third time. Which leaves us in a very weird place. Because now, the industry is in this really top-heavy era where the bulk of projects fit this very commercialistic style of filmmaking or fairly big-budget independent movies like Poor Things and Challengers. And then everything else falls to the bottom, with tiny release periods in cinemas, straight-to-streaming platforms, shoestring budgets, zero marketing, and then the industry wonders why independent cinema isn't flourishing. But when did independent cinema start to decline? And when was it flourishing? In order to get the full picture, we need to go back in time again, specifically to 1977. Hollywood in the 70s was an interesting time, to say the least. We saw the decline of the studio system, and the Brat Pack of Hollywood came along with a new wave of American auteurs. Directors like Francis Coppola, William Friedkin, Hal Ashby, Martin Scorsese, Roman Polanski, and Peter Bogdanovich were defining a new era of indie filmmaking. And with the success of The Godfather, The Exorcist, and Chinatown, released in 1972, 3 and 4, they showed the studios that it was possible to make low-budget movies with big profits. In 1969, Francis Coppola founded American Zoetrope, which he saw as a way of bringing in new talent to make low-budget films, a way of allowing the artists to have creative control and make the films they wanted to make. More on this later. Meanwhile, directors like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were working on something entirely different, the creation of the blockbuster and the popcorn picture. Star Wars was predicted to be a huge flop. Lucas had shared the script with his director friends who all thought it was terrible and wouldn't make any money. But regardless of the feedback he received, he persevered, insisting on the creation of new technology for the special effects of the film, on owning the rights to the music, merchandising, and sequels, and on using Dolby surround sound, and perhaps unknowingly changed the future of cinema forever. On opening weekend, Lucas hid out in a hotel in Hawaii because he was so nervous about the movie flopping. And one morning, he turned on his TV in the hotel room and saw reports of people queuing around the block to see it in cinemas. It made over $100 million in the first 3 months of it being released and took over Jaws in its overall profit sales, and thus giving us the blockbuster. However, this wasn't welcomed by all, with filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and Robert Altman expressing concern over the impact this would have on the film industry as a whole. At the time Star Wars was thriving at the box office, Scorsese's new picture New York, New York had flopped and was being obliterated by critics, with Pauline Kael herself saying that it marked a new era in filmmaking where the kinds of pictures Scorsese made would be replaced by the kinds of pictures Lucas made. Lucas argued that studio films had always existed, and that they subsidized the smaller movies that people like Scorsese wanted to make. But Scorsese and Altman disagreed. It didn't subsidize everything else, it took over everything else. But regardless of how they felt about it, the success of Star Wars and Jaws showed the studios that there was twice as much money to be made, and the studios couldn't resist. Franchise filmmaking exploded in the 80s, along with the creation of VHS, and George Lucas was seen as a hero. Meanwhile, the original Brat Pack weren't doing too well, and after spending too much money on flops, the suits were taking back control. Robert Redford created the Sundance Institute to celebrate independent film, and cinema started to split between studio and indie films, while some companies were trying to blur the line between the two, such as Miramax, created in '79 by the Weinstein brothers. The 90s and early noughties led to a shiny new wave of independent films, with small subsidiary companies set up such as 20th Century Fox, Sony Classic and DreamWorks, which are now the pillars of our current studio system. After the success of Pulp Fiction and before the rise of streaming and the financial crash, we saw the rise of a new golden era for indie filmmaking. Directors like Kelly Reichardt, Michael Haneke, Edward Yang, Tsai-Ming Liang, Jane Campion and Wong Kar-wai were all creating some of their best work. In the States, PTA gave us Punch Drunk Love and There Will Be Blood, whilst Gaspar Noé and Lars von Trier were making their rounds with shock cinema, creating the controversial classics we both love and hate, such as Dogville and Irreversible. Kathryn Bigelow became the first woman to win an Oscar for directing with The Hurt Locker. The comedy genre was thriving, and whilst it was perhaps a little oversaturated, who knew that this would die out completely? The rise of digital technology meant we had films like Titanic and Avatar, but there was still a steady balance between larger studio movies that were created through this new technology and the resurgence of several franchises, as well as the kinds of movies we associate with the indie scene and creative voices that were challenging the status quo, which is really all you can ask for. But in the 2010s, a few things happened that altered the course of the next decade, and perhaps not for the better. We saw the rise of streaming, superhero movies, sequels, reboots, and biopics, oh my. Netflix became more prominent within the distribution scene after creating exclusive deals with established filmmakers, such as Martin Scorsese for The Irishman and Alfonso Cuarón for Roma. The Netflix model offered creative freedom and control to both established and emerging directors, free from the interference of studio heads and advertising executives. More on this later. A24 quickly rose to power, offering a similar kind of creative freedom but with an emphasis on underseen stories, and their subsequent films on Moonlight changed the course of the industry forever, making people realise that stories about, quote, niche experiences could actually be very profitable and universal. Along with A24's championing of diverse stories, we saw the creation of the Me Too movement and public conversations about the industry's lack of diversity.
It was my cup of tea.
But this was also contrasted with the huge boom in franchise filmmaking and the Hollywood executives who favoured universality over specificity. And this is where things get complicated. The Netflix and A24 model sound like any filmmaker's dream: make whatever you want and get paid well to do it. And whilst both companies now make very different films, they both started on similar premises, a business model very similar to the one used for Coppola's company, American Zoetrope, and the promises made to the filmmakers that joined in the pre-Star Wars era. American Zoetrope is perhaps the earliest version of the Netflix and A24 model, a creative utopia for people whose ideas would previously have never made it through the Hollywood front gates. After starting American Zoetrope in San Francisco with George Lucas, Coppola eventually worked with directors like Wim Wenders, Akira Kurosawa, Paul Schrader, and Jean-Luc Godard, but not after a long and controversial beginning. After the colossal success of The Godfather, Coppola's ego was through the roof, and he was described as a man mad with power. Zoetrope gained additional funding for their next projects, but Coppola invested this into personal films that lost him a lot of money. His workers were working long hours with little pay, whilst Coppola was buying outrageously priced cars and drinking champagne in the cutting room. And so, the filmmakers and workers employed by Zoetrope started to quit and unionize. But Coppola didn't care. He had enough money, and he thought they should be, quote, kissing the ground they worked on as they were so lucky to be with him, that this was the price they had to pay for their creative freedom. And herein lies the crux of the problem. Because in recent years, we've seen the exact same thing happen with the Netflix model, as well as with many other companies. People in the industry say they want more autobiographical, diverse stories, but then these same studios keep abandoning this model of filmmaking to favour big-budget movies, IP, and universal stories. And when they do fund smaller projects, the rules and conditions of release are very different depending on the universality and potential financial success of the project. But you can't complain because either way, they funded your movie. You're one of the lucky ones. Modern media lured filmmakers with creative freedom only to steal this very freedom. Smaller independent directors are given less creative control, often with no release period in cinemas, only to be shoved onto the back shelf of their streaming platform with no marketing, only to be removed in a year or so. And now, these directors are told they're forbidden from releasing physical copies of their films, and because Netflix owns the distribution rights, they ultimately have no say in how the film is seen. So if the film is removed from their platforms and you legally aren't allowed to create DVDs, then your work is lost forever, or at least inaccessible to the majority of audiences. You can get your film made, but at what cost? And after the commercial success of high-budget Netflix productions such as Stranger Things, The Red Notice, and Damsel, their business model now favours these blockbuster projects, which is evident in their recently announced Russo brothers film, The Electric State, with a reported budget of $320 million, also starring Chris Pratt. Netflix appears to be abandoning independent projects entirely, either financing more high-budget action movies or roping indie directors into dodgy contracts where the circumstances of the release means the work hardly stands a chance. And with the introduction of ads to their business model, it's hard to see a future in which the creative integrity and vision of their collaborators isn't further compromised and perhaps censored to appease the advertising executives, which goes against Netflix's founding principle, a streaming service without ads. Whilst the A24 model is very different, it essentially started with a similar goal of making filmmaking more accessible, with a focus on unseen stories that push boundaries. And I love A24 in general as a company. In recent years, they've produced some of my favourite work. But with talks of the company being sold to anonymous external investors, it's unsure whether this will be sustained. We've seen a similar thing happen to Pixar, who had a great run of films that didn't speak down to the experiences of children. But they recently released a statement saying, the studio's movies should be less a pursuit of any director's catharsis, and instead speak to a commonality of experience. Pixar is now focusing on films with clear mass appeal, with less focus on directors' autobiographical tales like Luca and Turning Red. The people in power are still peddling the same narrative about how they care about diverse stories and supporting smaller films, but every decision they make pulls them in the opposite direction. These studios were created to showcase independent filmmaking and a wider range of stories, with a value on specificity in order to speak to more people. But ultimately, this new Pixar rule isn't about universality. They say Turning Red was a risky project because it was about puberty, but so is Inside Out 2. I wonder why they see that film as being more universal. Universal to who exactly? The people in power don't care about movies. They care about money. These new rules and preferences towards certain types of projects has nothing to do with storytelling, creative integrity, or connection. It's about profit. There are some people who have never been richer, and with record high box office sales from Top Gun, Barbie, and Oppenheimer in the post-pandemic era of cinema, the idea that there isn't enough money to make independent films is bullshit. There is money, people just don't want to spend it or take risks. And when you take away the risk from every project, how creative can you really be? And if you're essentially censoring the types of stories that can be shared based on whether or not they're, quote, universal, it seems like a sad road towards safe and mediocre stories that won't challenge or add anything to the artistic landscape. It might as well be written by a robot. Oh wait. But the thing is, when independent projects are successful, the same studios are the ones desperately squeezing any ounce of profit or success out of it. The Blair Witch Project was famously a very low-budget film, costing $35,000 to make and earning nearly $250 million. But the cast were fairly compensated for the success, right? Right? During the strikes of last year, the cast revealed that they barely made any money from the project, that they were sent fruit baskets when the film made $100 million and barred from booking other roles to maintain the illusion the characters were real people, which is pretty disgusting. There will always be people that want to reap the benefits of these projects' success without fully investing or supporting the filmmakers. And when they do succeed, they often define this success as coming from reductionist factors in an attempt to replicate this success in another project. Although it's far from an independent film, we saw this with Barbie and the studios that are now investing in more product/brand movies, thinking that Barbie's success came from the fact that it's about a product and not because it was directed by Greta Gerwig. Art and advertising are slowly merging together. The only function that people see in art these days is if it's in service of a product. And when the awards ceremonies only recognise and praise these bigger budget blockbuster movies, it only affirms the status quo and makes it less likely that smaller films will get funding at all. Because as much as we think the Oscars is stupid, it very much has an effect on the type of movies that get greenlit. And when most of the Academy members are straight white men, it's unlikely that they're going to vote for or even watch something like I Saw the TV Glow over Oppenheimer, meaning that the same projects keep winning and the same projects keep getting funding, because the validation of the Academy actually means something to the studio executives. Even if we can just about make these movies on a small scale, they're always stuck at the same level because the people with power refuse to recognise them, which makes it harder for these directors to make more films. Because even if Janet Planet is objectively better than Oppenheimer, they're more likely to greenlight another film from the director with an Oscar, rather than the director who hasn't, even when we all know which film has more substance. More wealth needs to be invested into independent filmmaking and public creator funds that are accessible to new and emerging artists, funds that allow more creatives to make $1 million movie and make whatever they want, and to do so on their own terms. If there are more opportunities available, then naturally a more diverse range of projects will be shared, because there will be more people able to create something that is authentic to them, instead of one opportunity available that means they have to create something authentic and representative of everyone. Independent filmmaking deserves to thrive and flourish again, because some of the best work comes from people who work with little, but think outside the box and make daring, original work that amplifies wonderfully unique voices. Showcasing a range of specific experiences that allows everyone to feel seen is what creates universality, and that is why people keep watching movies. Nothing was quite as divisive in Babylon as the ending, a famously controversial montage of movie moments with choppy editing and the crashing of music and colour. And when asked about the decision to include this, Damien Chazelle said, "I think it's the idea of someone, in this case Manny, reflecting on his life. You can't help but be aware of how much bigger it is than you, and how you're a part of something bigger. Just to be a small part of that is, in its own way, really special and eternal. Even if you aren't really a part of it, to be a part of it in any way is a special thing. It's brutal, unrelentless, and also meaningful, life-affirming, and joyful. And Babylon is about how all of these things are true. How the industry seems to need a mix of everything in order to survive. It's a walking contradiction that's the best and worst thing." But you might be thinking, what's the point of this video? Why am I making an essay about everything wrong with the industry? And it's a good question, and something I've been asking myself over the past 4 months I've been working on it. At first it was pure frustration, anger, disgust, then curiosity, hopelessness, and a bit of revenge. And then it became somewhat of a lifeline, a reassurance. If you've been following my channel for a little while, you'll have witnessed the many, many breakdowns I've had about my journey into this industry. Some I've spoken about explicitly, some I've only hinted at, because you can't have a voice when you're a nobody in this industry, especially when you're working for a somebody that could ruin your career if you complain or even express a hint of something that isn't sheer joy and gratitude. I've gone through periods of being extremely depressed about job hunting, the way the industry works, and all the dead ends as I tried to get a foot in the door. Or actually finding work in the industry only to be gaslit, exploited, fired, and told to work in a cafe for 7 years and learn what it really means to sacrifice myself for my art. And whilst I'm grateful that I eventually did get my foot in the door, the idea of being grateful for being here started to become a silencing tool. It's why so many people in this industry can't complain or use their voice, because they're made to feel lucky just for being accepted or given an entry-level opportunity, and that your entire career relies on your silence over anything you don't agree with. That if you do express concern or discomfort, you'll be replaced with someone desperate for a job that won't say a word. But being given an opportunity doesn't mean that you owe your life to the person who gave it to you, or that you should sweep all the shitty behaviour under the rug, even if that's what the industry still expects. After a while of feeling like this, and that I just had to be grateful and there was something wrong with me for feeling bad about things that were happening, I really started to doubt myself and question whether this was something I could do at all. I thought that maybe truly passionate people wouldn't be deterred by the issues I was facing. Surely if I was actually deserving of a place, then I wouldn't consider quitting, that it was all somehow my fault. Until I realised something crucial. Hollywood isn't designed for you to succeed. It's designed so that only certain people can survive. Usually people that aren't that great to begin with who make the place even worse. There's a whole system designed against your success. But I realised that if I did quit, I would be letting those people win. And if film is going to thrive and move forward and flourish, then it needs new people. This is the only thing that keeps creativity alive. The brutal and nearly impossible process of breaking into the industry eliminates so many passionate and wonderful people that deserve to share their ideas and do what they love, that either can't break in or won't sacrifice their values and integrity for the sake of working in a toxic industry that doesn't want them to begin with. But when new people aren't allowed in, nothing changes, because the same people are succeeding and not doing anything to challenge the status quo. But if the industry is going to change, it needs new and different people whose presence will create change. And as brutal as that first step is, if you really want it and feel that you can, you have to try. A lot of people have become complicit with the idea that things are better, that the industry has truly changed. And if you genuinely believe that, then you're either contributing towards or complicit to these problems, because the stats aren't changing, and this kind of thinking only creates stagnancy and stalls real progress. Yes, some things have improved. Sets are far more inclusive and diverse, and there are a few more people given opportunities to direct that aren't just white men. But the overall numbers aren't changing anywhere else. there are still hardly any marginalised people in leading roles or positions of power in the industry, and not nearly enough given the chance to direct. It's all very well and good having more diverse crews, but if the people actually greenlighting films and deciding which stories deserve to be shared are the same, then nothing really changes. So if you asked me again why I made this is what I would say. I wanted to make this for my friends and to anyone else trying to break into the industry that is experiencing the same and who deserves better. And much like Babylon, I wanted to take a risk. Because even if this industry does chew me up and I fail, at least I've tried my best to leave a mark and move it forward. Maybe my contributions will be eaten up and I'll be thrown away. But during the final scene of Babylon, the camera drifts over the audience, making a spectacle out of ourselves, the watchers, the makers. It reminds us of the people who offer their lives for the big screen, who share their stories and take risks. Because maybe all we can do is keep going, dive headfirst into the machine, hold on for as long as you can, and to be a part of something bigger.